My brother announced my seat at his rehearsal dinner like he was reading a verdict. "You're at the kids' table, Meg. It's actually kind of perfect for you." He said it loud enough that his future in-laws heard it from across the room, and he smiled the whole time, like he'd done me a favor. What none of them knew was that in my purse, underneath a pack of tissues and a dead lipstick, was a federal judiciary badge that could have made every lawyer in that room stand up straighter. I am 31 years old. For the last 7 years, my family has believed I work as a court clerk, shuffling papers in a beige government office somewhere in downtown Chicago. I let them believe it. I had my reasons, and they were good ones. But I never imagined that my brother's wedding weekend would be the moment everything unraveled in front of 200 guests, 3 television cameras filming the reception, and the one man in that room who had argued a case in front of me 6 months earlier and didn't recognize me until it was too late. Let me start at the beginning because you need to understand who these people are before you can understand what happened. My brother Cole is 40 years old. He runs a commercial real estate firm in Naperville that our father seeded with $200,000 when Cole was 26. The firm does well. Cole has made sure everyone in our extended family knows exactly how well, down to the square footage of his house and the horsepower of whatever he drives that year. When he got engaged to a woman named Vanessa, who comes from a family of orthopedic surgeons in Lake Forest, the wedding became a production. Not a celebration. A production. There is a difference. And that difference cost somebody, mostly our parents, somewhere north of $80,000. I wasn't in the wedding party. Cole had explained this to me 18 months earlier over a phone call that lasted 6 minutes. "It's just, the aesthetic is very curated," he said. "Vanessa has 4 bridesmaids, and they're all within 2 inches of each other in height, and honestly, Meg, it would just be a lot of coordination. You understand." I said I understood. I didn't understand. But I had learned over many years that disagreeing with Cole on the phone meant he'd call our mother. Our mother would call me, and then I'd have to spend 45 minutes convincing her that I wasn't jealous of him and that no, I wasn't depressed and that yes, I was eating properly and no, I hadn't driven away another boyfriend through my, quote, emotional unavailability. So I said I understood, and I hung up, and I sat for a few minutes in my office on the 22nd floor of the Dirksen Federal Building, looking out at the Chicago skyline, and then I went back to work. The rehearsal dinner was at a restaurant called Henley's on the river. Private room, 40 people, a fixed menu that started at $90 a plate. I drove myself from my apartment in Lincoln Park, parked in a garage 2 blocks away, and walked in wearing a navy dress I'd bought 3 years ago for a collie's retirement ceremony. It was fine. It was appropriate. My mother, when she saw me in the lobby, touched the sleeve of the dress with 2 fingers like she was checking whether it was still wet. "You couldn't have done something with your hair," she said, by way of greeting. My father shook my hand. He always shakes my hand. He's shaken my hand at Christmas, at Thanksgiving, at both my law school graduations. Yes, both. I did my undergraduate degree in 3 years and then went straight to Georgetown, since I was approximately 14 years old and he decided I was too old to hug. I don't know when he started hugging Cole. He still does. The room was arranged with long tables. Cole and Vanessa sat at the center of the head table with her parents on one side and ours on the other. Then there were tables for Vanessa's extended family, tables for Cole's colleagues, a table for the wedding party, and a table near the back, partially obscured by a floral arrangement the size of a small shrub, where I was seated with Vanessa's 12-year-old niece, her 14-year-old nephew, and a cousin of Cole's from our mother's side who was visiting from Phoenix and spoke very little English. I found my name card. I stood there for a moment reading it. Meg. Not Margaret. Not Dr. Margaret Calloway. Which I technically was, though I don't use the title socially. Just Meg, written in the same calligraphy as everyone else's, except everyone else's was on a table with wine glasses that had already been filled. Cole appeared behind me. He had the look he always gets when he thinks he's being generous. A kind of performed warmth, like a man handing out umbrellas in weather he personally caused. "You're at the kids' table, Meg. It's actually kind of perfect for you." He paused to let a nearby couple hear this clearly. "You're so good with kids. Vanessa's niece is going through a thing. It'll be good for her to have someone grounded to talk to." He squeezed my shoulder once, the way you squeeze a piece of fruit to check if it's ripe, and walked back to the head table. I sat down. Vanessa's niece, whose name was Harper, looked at me with the unflinching judgment that only a 12-year-old can produce, and said, "Are you in trouble or something?" "No," I said. "Then why are you back here?" I looked at her. "Good question." The dinner was served in courses. From the back of the room, I watched my brother hold court at the head table. He told stories about his deals. He told the story about the time he negotiated a lease for a client in 3 hours on a golf course in Scottsdale. He told a story I had heard 11 times about the summer he spent interning at a firm in New York, and how he could have stayed but chose to come back to Illinois because he believed in his home state. He glanced at me twice during the meal, once to make sure I was watching, and once to make sure I wasn't causing a scene. I ate my salmon. I talked to Harper about our soccer team. I drank my water because no one had come by to offer me wine. And when I finally flagged down a server and asked for a glass of the burgundy they were pouring at the other tables, he looked at his list and told me the wine service was pre-arranged by table. And my table had been designated a soft drinks package. Soft drinks. My table had a soft drinks package. I ordered a sparkling water and held the glass for a moment, and I thought about the week I'd just had. On Monday, I had issued a preliminary injunction halting a billion-dollar infrastructure project pending environmental review. On Wednesday, I had presided over the sentencing of a man who had run a 14-year financial fraud scheme. On Thursday, I had been mentioned in a Reuters article about federal judicial appointments alongside 2 other judges as one of the most significant voices in Northern District case law in the last decade. On Friday evening, I was drinking a sparkling water at a children's table while my brother explained to his future father-in-law how he saw the Chicago commercial real estate market trending over the next 18 months. I didn't let myself feel sorry for myself. I had made choices. I'd kept my work private and I had done it deliberately, and I stood by it. When I was 26 and just finishing law school, I had come home for Christmas and told my family I'd been accepted to clerk for a federal circuit judge. My father had looked up from his plate and said, "Clerking is a support role, Meg. You're doing the judge's work for them. Is that what you want?" Cole had said, "How much does it pay?" My mother had said she just hoped I'd be able to find an apartment in Washington on that salary because the cost of living there was extraordinary, and had I looked into roommates. So when I went back to Chicago and then into private practice, and then into the federal system, and then up through it further than I had ever planned, I stopped mentioning it. Not in a dramatic secret-keeping way, just in the way that you stop bringing a dish to a potluck when people consistently push it to the edge of the table. They stopped asking. I stopped offering. 7 years passed. I found out later from my mother that she told people I worked in the courts and when pressed, said I was in administrative work. She wasn't embarrassed exactly. It was more that she didn't understand what I did well enough to describe it, and rather than ask me, she filled in the blank with something that sounded stable and modest and unlikely to prompt follow-up questions. The rehearsal dinner ended around 10. I helped Harper figure out how to call her mother on her new phone. I shook hands with Vanessa's parents, who were perfectly pleasant people who had done nothing wrong. I found my coat. I was almost to the door when Cole caught up with me. "Hey." He was in a good mood. Expansive. "Good dinner, right? Henley's is the best in the city for private events, honestly." The salmon was exceptional. "It was good," I said. "Listen, tomorrow's a big day." He adjusted his cuffs. He had cufflinks with his initials on them. "I need you to basically be invisible during the photos. Vanessa's photographer has a whole vision. Very architectural, very clean lines, and I just need the family grouping to be simple. So maybe just stand where they put you, and don't. He made a vague gesture. "Don't what?" "Don't make it weird, Meg. You have a tendency to make things weird by looking like you'd rather be somewhere else." He said this warmly. That was the thing about Cole. Everything was delivered warmly. The cruelty came wrapped in a kind of fond exasperation. Like you were a beloved but dim household pet. "It's your face. You just look like you're solving a math problem all the time." "I'll try to look normal," I said. "Great." He clapped me on the arm. "And maybe borrow something from Mom for the ceremony? That dress is fine, but it's just a little." He tilted his head. "Government." I drove home. I sat in my car in the parking garage under my building for a few minutes. I wasn't going to cry. I hadn't cried in front of anyone in my family since I was 19, and I didn't plan to start now. But I sat there for a bit, and I thought about the word invisible, and I thought about how efficiently Cole had managed, in the space of 12 hours, to reduce me to a woman in a mediocre dress who should stand quietly in the background and be grateful for the salmon. I thought about what was in my apartment upstairs: the shelves of case reporters, the framed copy of my judicial commission, signed by the President of the United States, the bench that I sat on 5 days a week, where attorneys who billed $400 an hour stood and addressed me as Your Honor. I thought about the wedding the next day, and the guest list, and one name I'd noticed on the printed program at the rehearsal dinner. His name was Franklin Dodd. He was a senior partner at a firm called Whitmore Dodd, and 6 months ago, he had stood before me and argued. Badly, I thought, though the case itself was strong, a breach of contract dispute involving a pharmaceutical company and a Chicago hospital system. I had ruled in his client's favor. He had, according to my clerk who read the legal press more carefully than I did, told an interviewer afterward that the Northern District was finally getting sharper judicial appointments. He had not seen my face outside of a courtroom. He had not connected the name on the wedding program to the woman who would be sitting in the back corner with the sparkling water and the 12-year-old. Not yet. The wedding ceremony was at a historic church in the Gold Coast. The reception was at a hotel ballroom 2 blocks away. The family photos were taken in a garden between the two venues in October in 48-degree weather. I stood where I was told. I did not make it weird. I wore a deep green dress I'd bought specifically for the day, and if it was not the dress Cole would have chosen for me, it was at least not government. The reception was beautiful, objectively. The hotel ballroom had been transformed. There were centerpieces that looked like someone had transplanted a corner of an English garden indoors. The lighting was warm and exact. The table assignment had everyone in neat configurations, and I was seated this time at a table near the dance floor. Not the kids' table, since there were no children at the reception, but effectively its spiritual equivalent, a table with Vanessa's elderly aunt, who was hard of hearing, 2 colleagues of Cole's who had clearly been placed there because they were junior and not yet interesting enough for a better table, and a man I'd never met named Phil who had driven up from Bloomington and spent the first 20 minutes of the reception explaining to me how he personally felt about Chicago traffic. I smiled. I listened. I drank the Pinot Gris that was actually being poured at this table, because the reception had an open bar and I had located it during cocktail hour and availed myself of a glass with quiet efficiency. Cole gave a toast. It was long. It was very much about Cole, his journey to finding Vanessa, his growth as a man, the lessons he'd learned in business that had prepared him for marriage. He thanked his parents. He thanked his groomsmen by name. He thanked at the end, in the way that someone thanks the cleaning crew. Everyone else who made the effort to be here. I was pretty sure that was me. Then something happened that I had not expected. Vanessa's father stood to give his toast. He was a man named Dr. Robert Hale, a reconstructive surgeon with steady hands and a delivery that was comfortable in front of crowds. He welcomed Cole to the family. He said some things about Vanessa as a child that made people laugh, and then he said he wanted to acknowledge some of the guests, because Vanessa had told him she had friends and family in the room who had accomplished things worth celebrating. He looked down at a note card. "We have a federal judge in the room tonight," he said. "The Honorable Margaret Calloway of the United States District Court for the Northern District of Illinois. Vanessa tells me she was a law school classmate of the bride. And I just want to say," he raised his glass, "we are honored." The room turned. 200 people looked for a federal judge. I was holding a fork. At the table near the edge of the dance floor in the deep green dress, I set the fork down carefully and nodded once. The way you acknowledge a courtroom that has just stood for you. The applause started at the Hale family table and spread. Genuine, surprised, generous applause. I watched my brother's face. It went through several phases. Confusion first. The specific confusion of someone who has heard a name they know applied to a title they did not associate with it. Then a kind of recalibration, features rearranging in real time. Then, and this was the part I will not forget, he looked at me across the room with an expression I had never seen from him before. It was not guilt exactly. It was something more disorienting than guilt. It was the look of a man who has just realized he has been reading a map upside down for a very long time. Franklin Dodd was at a table 12 feet from mine. I heard him before I saw him react. He said to whoever was sitting beside him, "I'm sorry, Margaret Calloway?" And then he turned and found me and went extremely still. I gave him a small nod. Professional. Appropriate. He looked like a man replaying a specific conversation in his head, checking for anything that might need to be retracted. Cole reached me during the dinner service. He came to my table without his wife, without a drink in his hand, which was notable because Cole always had something to do with his hands. He stood behind the empty chair next to me and held the back of it. "Why didn't you tell me?" he said. "Tell you what? Meg!" His voice was different. Not warm, not performing. Just flat and strange. "You're a federal judge." "Yes." "Since when?" "4 years." He stared at me. 4 years. He was appointed at 27. I was confirmed at 28. I've been sitting on the Northern District bench for 4 years. He pulled out the chair and sat down. He didn't ask if he could. He just sat there for a moment looking at the centerpiece. "You didn't think that was worth mentioning?" "I mentioned things," I said. "Nobody was particularly interested." He opened his mouth and closed it again. "When I got my clerkship," I said, keeping my voice even, keeping it quiet, "Dad told me I was doing someone else's work for them. When I passed the bar, Mom asked about my salary. When I made law review at Georgetown, he told me at Thanksgiving that the food had gone cold. These weren't conversations where I felt like offering more information would go well." Cole was quiet. "I wasn't hiding," I said. "I just stopped announcing." Franklin Dodd appeared at my elbow. He was flushed, but composed. He was a good attorney, whatever I thought of the specific argument he'd made in my courtroom. "Your Honor," he said, and the title landed in the space between Cole and me like a dropped piece of silverware. "I apologize for interrupting. I just wanted to say, it's an honor to see you outside of, well." He glanced at Cole. "Outside of the courthouse." Cole looked at him. "You know my sister?" Franklin Dodd took a beat too long to process the word sister. Yes." Judge Calloway presided over Whitmore Dodd's contract dispute with Northside Medical last spring. He turned back to me. "Your ruling was one of the most clearly reasoned decisions I've seen at the district level in 15 years of practice." He excused himself. He was tactful about it. Cole sat very still. My mother found us about 10 minutes later. She had been working her way across the reception from the moment Dr. Hale finished his toast, and she arrived at my table with the energy of someone who has been speed-walking since a starting pistol fired. She sat down without preamble, leaned in close, and said, "Why didn't you tell us? A federal judge, Meg, appointed by the president. That's why on earth didn't you tell your family?" I told Dad I was clerking. He said it was a support role. "You were 23. I was 26. And I was right." My mother looked at the table. We worried about you. You always seemed so quiet, alone." I thought about that. I thought about my apartment, which had a view of the lake and a kitchen I'd learned to actually cook in, and a study where I kept every book I'd read since law school. I thought about the clerks I mentored, the colleagues I met for drinks on Fridays, the neighborhood running group I joined the previous spring. I thought about the fact that the loneliness my family worried about was, largely, the loneliness they had produced by making it clear, over many years, that who I actually was didn't quite fit the frame they built for me. "I'm not alone," I said. "I'm just not what you imagined." Cole was still at the table. He hadn't left, which surprised me. He said, without looking up, "The kids' table, last night. I told you to be invisible at the photos." He said it slowly, like he was reading charges against himself. "I told you your dress looked government. I didn't say anything. You had a federal commission," he said. "You were. Meg, you were at a children's table." "I know." He looked at me then, and he didn't have any of his usual equipment. Not the warmth, not the performance, not the cufflinks catching the light in a way that suggested significance. He just looked like my brother, which was something I hadn't seen in a long time. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm genuinely sorry." I looked at him for a moment. He meant it. I could tell when Cole meant something, even after all the years of practice delivery. This was the face underneath the face. "I know," I said. "I accept that." He waited for something more. Some absolution, some pivot to warmth, some offer to repair it quickly. I didn't give him one. I had learned, slowly and then all at once, that accepting an apology is not the same as returning to baseline. You can forgive someone completely and still not pretend the last 20 years happened differently. You can love your brother and still understand that love without respect is just a feeling. It doesn't actually give someone access to your life. I stayed for the first dance. I stayed for the cake. I shook Dr. Hale's hand and thanked him sincerely because what he had done was not nothing. He'd seen something on a seating chart and decided it was worth acknowledging, and I wouldn't forget that. I found Harper, Vanessa's niece, and she told me her team had won their game that morning, and I told her I was glad. I got my coat from the coat check and walked out into the October night. The street outside the hotel was lit with the specific clarity of a cold Chicago evening. Everything sharp-edged and clean. I walked to my car. I didn't call anyone. I didn't check my phone. I just walked, past the restaurant starting to fill for late dinner, past a couple sharing an umbrella even though it wasn't raining, past a man walking a very small dog with enormous dignity. At some point on that walk, I realized I wasn't angry. I had been angry for years. A low, banked, carefully managed anger that I'd gotten very good at not displaying, and it was gone. Not because my brother had apologized, though he had, and he'd meant it, but because it had finally found somewhere to go. My family had spent 20 years looking at me and seeing what they expected. And then, in a hotel ballroom in the Gold Coast, reality had quietly corrected the record, without my having to raise my voice once. The following Monday, I was back on the bench. My clerk brought me the docket at 8:45 and set a coffee on the corner of my desk without being asked. At 9, the courtroom deputy called the room to order. The attorney stood. I walked in, and I sat down, and I looked at the people in that room, the lawyers, the parties, the clerk, the court reporter, the marshals by the door, and I felt the solid, specific weight of a life that was entirely mine. I had built it in the years when no one was watching, and that, I had finally decided, was not the tragedy my family had always made it sound like. It was the whole point. The night Dr. Hale stood up and said my name, I didn't feel triumph. I felt something quieter than that, something closer to relief. Like a breath I'd been holding for so long, I'd forgotten it was held. I think about Cole's face a lot, not with satisfaction, the way I might have imagined I would, just with the kind of sad clarity. He wasn't a cruel person, not at the core of it. He was a person who had never been asked to look carefully, and so he never did. He looked at the surface of things, the dress, the car, the table assignment, and he took the surface of the whole story. That's not a character flaw so much as a failure of curiosity. And I've come to believe that the willingness to stay curious, to keep asking what you don't yet understand, is one of the most important things a person can either develop or let atrophy. Cole let it atrophy. He got comfortable with the version of me that required nothing from him, and he stopped updating it. What I built in those 7 years of silence wasn't a secret. It was a life. I made choices that required me to trust my own judgment when no one around me was confirming it. I passed exams and argued motions and wrote opinions in a building where nobody cared what my brother drove or whether my dress looked government. I got good at something real, and I got good at it without applause. That's harder than it sounds. Most of us are wired to need some external signal that we're on the right track. I had to learn to generate that signal from inside, to sit with the work itself and decide that the work was enough. That took years. It took failing at it first. There were nights I drove home from the courthouse wondering if any of it meant anything, if the silence from my family was evidence that I'd chosen wrong. I had to keep choosing anyway. That's what persistence actually looks like, I think. Not grand gestures of determination. Just continuing, quietly, on a Thursday night when nobody is watching and nothing is guaranteed. And then, there's the question of what I did with the moment when it came. Cole apologized, he meant it, and I accepted it without using it as a transaction, without converting his guilt into leverage, without making him perform remorse for longer than it was genuine. That choice was harder than the years of silence, honestly, because by the time he said he was sorry, I had every right to let him feel the weight of it for a while. But holding someone in their worst moment when they've genuinely recognized it is its own kind of smallness. It doesn't cost me anything to let a person grow. It only costs me something if I refuse to. I've thought about Harper, Vanessa's niece, at the back table with me. 12 years old, already watching adults to figure out how the world sorts people. I hope she noticed that the woman eating salmon at the wrong table was the one who turned out to matter. I hope she filed that away somewhere. Because the world will put her at wrong tables too, and she will have to decide whether that placement is information about her or information about the people doing the seating. It was never about the table. It was about knowing, even when no one else did, exactly who was sitting at it.